Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today, I'm extremely honored to introduce this special guest, Ken Wilber, widely regarded as one of the most influential thinkers of our time. Known as the father of integral theory, Ken has developed a groundbreaking framework that synthesizes insights from science, philosophy, psychology, spirituality, and more. His work has profoundly shaped how we understand human development, consciousness, and the complexities of modern life. Ken, I've been waiting for this interview for such a long time. I'm deeply honored to have you on my channel. Thank you so much for.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
I know so many people whose spiritual journey you have been a big influence, including mine. So this interview means a lot to me because even to get to this point where to be able to have a one-on-one conversation, I feel like it's such a journey. So I would love to first begin with how what are the hallmarks or milestones do you think are in a person's waking up journey, and how you experience them in your own waking up journey?
Yeah, well, for waking up, it's first of all a capacity to enter a meditative state. Now, a meditative state means simply being aware of everything that's arising, all your thoughts, all your feelings, all your perceptions, and you don't judge them. So you don't have a negative feeling about them, you don't condemn them, you don't think bad things about them, nor do you like them. You're not attracted to them, you're not attached. You're just witnessing. And as the witness, you are actually what Vedanta would say, one with your higher self. Human beings, the mystical traditions maintain, have two separate selves. They have the small, egoic, relative self, and then we have the real, true, big self. And the whole point about finding your big self is it's one with everything, including God. If you want to think about ultimate reality as a God, your true self is one with God. The Hindus call it Brahman Atman. Your Atman, your separate self, is one with Brahman, or the ultimate reality. So that's a pretty good first step to finding that you're one with everything. And there's a little gimmick of a metaphor that I sometimes use to explain what being one with everything means. And it was invented by Douglas Harding, who's a member of the London Buddhist Society. And he explained this in a book he called On Having No Head. And he meant that sort of facetiously in a funny way, but he also meant it very seriously. By the way, I knocked a tooth out here, if you're wondering what that space is. But he points out that in the book On Having No Head, he says you can see every part of your body. You can see your toes, your feet, your ankles, your legs, your thighs, your waist, your stomach, your chest, your arms, your fingers. But there's one thing you can't see. You can't see your head. And no matter how you try to, if you try to see your head, all you'll see are sort of two fleshy blobs arising up, but you can't see your head. And that's a very peculiar situation. But then Douglas Harding says, actually, if you look at it, you can see your head, because where you think your head is right now on this side of your face, what is actually arising on this side of your face? Everything you're looking at. So you're not seeing the mountain. You are one with the mountain. The mountain is arising right where you thought your head was. And the sun comes up right where you thought your head was. And this computer screen is existing right on your shoulders, right where you thought your head was. And that's what you actually see if you look at the world. So the seer and the seen are what's called not two. They're a non-dual reality. they're a unity. And this is true all the time. It was always true yesterday, whether you realized it or not. It'll be true tomorrow, whether you think about it or not. But it's this unified, headless condition that is one with everything that you're aware of. And that's a very real reality. And he calls it the headless condition. So that headless condition is a unified awareness, this one with everything you're aware of right now. It's all arising right where you thought your head was, on this side of your face, and that's all you directly see. And there's no space between you and anything that you're seeing, because it's all on this side of your face, arising right where you thought your head was. So that's a sort of an introduction to cosmic consciousness, or an ultimate state of reality. And you want to get to that as a very real, profound, deep reality, a very real experience, a very real awareness, a very real reality. And when you get to that perfect state of oneness with everything that you're experiencing right now, that is very close to an ultimate reality, because you're in touch with the ground of all being, which happens to be your headless condition. And that is the ground of everything that you're aware of. So that's a brief summary of some of the hallmarks that you'll have as you come to this greater unity awareness.
Thank you for sharing that. I've so many people who have experienced self-realization seem to communicate this similar message in different words.
Right.
And one of the things I've noticed is that even, especially in the Advaita world, there are a lot of different opinions on a lot of different opinions, in the sense that there are some who see self-realization as the final stage, where there are some who see self-realization as the beginning, as the first step into
what?
as the first step, as the beginning to your journey towards enlightenment.
Right.
What are your thoughts?
Did you say there was a self-realization?
Yes, self-realization. Like some see this as either you wake up or you don't, and once you wake up, that is it. Like there's nothing more than that.
Right.
Try to pursue more. That is more like concepts of the mind.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on that? Do you see self-realization as just the beginning?
Well, it can have degrees of depth, and the important thing is to realize your absolute oneness with everything that you're aware of right now. So you don't see the mountains, you are the mountains. You don't see the clouds, you are the clouds. You don't feel the earth, you are the earth. You don't see this computer screen, you are one with this computer screen. And of course, it's all resting right where you thought your head was. But the point is, that is a real self-realization, because when you realize that unity consciousness, that is your highest self, Brahman. And Brahman is, of course, one with Godhead, one with Tao, one with Christ consciousness, however you want to think of that. And that is a self-realization, because your small self is letting go of an identity with the ego and is realizing its true self. So it has a self-realization. And that's a realization with this absolute oneness with everything. And you are literally one with everything. And if you realize that ultimate oneness, that is the highest realization that you can have. So you're not going to have some higher realization. All you can have is a deepening understanding of that oneness. So you'll feel it more ever present, and you won't be forgetting it and having to remind yourself all the time and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's like once you see it, you see it.
Right.
It can't be unseen.
Right.
And I had some questions about spiral dynamics. I wanted to get into the stages of that. Before I ask those questions, one thing I've noticed in Advaita world is that when we talk about things like in stages, in spiral dynamics, there's a tendency to misinterpret as hierarchy and creating more like mental concepts. Like their criticism is that when we talk about things in stages, we are feeding more concepts to the mind. Uh, um, so how do you um, explain some people who may have those criticisms?
Well, it's true that when you talk about stages, you're dealing with abstract thoughts. Because if you introspect or look within or notice your own behavior, you don't see it in stages. And that's why we refer to our pronouns as first person, second person, and third person. First person is the perspective of the person speaking. So it's pronouns like I, me, mine. Second person is the perspective of the person being spoken to. So that's a you, thou, thine, so on. And third person is the person or thing being spoken about. So that's a he, she, they, them, it, its, and so on. And when you have those experiences, it's fairly obvious if you're referring, I mean, if you think about it and you introspect and you interpret what you're experiencing, you can tell the difference when you're using a first person or a second person or a third person pronoun. So those are fairly real events. But what you can't see is no matter how much you look within, unless you actually study something like developmental psychology and learn the stages as they unfold, and then learn to apply them to yourself, wherever you might be on that stage conception, you can do that. But that's not an obvious thing. And for that reason, when we talk about waking up, which is an enlightenment or awakening or a self-realization experience, that's a first-person experience. You have that. If you're sitting in the forest and all of a sudden you become one with everything and love and bliss, you know it. It's a first-person conscious experience, and you directly are aware of it. It fills your awareness, and you know you're experiencing this oneness. But if you look at the stages of what we call growing up, which is different from waking up is a first person, direct, immediate experience. But growing up consists of third person stages of development. So they're like Gene Gebser named his stages: archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, and integral. And spiral dynamics has variation on those same stages, as do all developmental psychologists. That's the interesting thing about developmental psychology, is they all agree on the general nature of these stages as they unfold. So but you can't see those stages and by themselves. I mean, it just wouldn't dawn on you to say, oh, yes, I'm aware of that I have a first person stage, and I'm aware of that second person stage, and I see that third person stage. That's not what it's like. They're all third person. They're all objects or things that exist in you, but you're not really that aware of them. So for that reason, although waking up as a pathway was discovered probably hundreds of thousands of years ago, because if you have an experience of being one with everything, you know it. And you're going to tell other people and share it and see if you can get them to have that experience. And so even all of the earliest native tribes had some sort of spiritual experience. and they would, maybe it was being one with the earth or one with the manifest universe, but they had that conception. And they were at least going back that we know of 50,000 years. So that's a very real realm. But growing up, these stages that we go through, archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, and integral, those weren't discovered until around 100 years ago. Because no matter how much we looked within, we couldn't see them. We didn't even know we were going through all those stages. I remember when I first learned about what I call growing up, or these developmental stages, I was just floored. I couldn't believe that I had gone through an archaic stage, a magic stage, a mythic stage, a rational stage, a pluralistic stage, and I was running into integral stages. I was just astounded by that. But it really impressed me, and I started studying all the developmental models there are. And I actually wrote a book called Integral Psychology, where I listed the various stages of development, and I had over 100 different models of developmental psychology, 100 that had investigated those stages. Because once we found out about them, and we found out about them because of a genius psychologist named James Mark Baldwin around 1900 discovered that all of our mental contents actually go and grow through stages. We call them the stages of growing up because of that. And James Mark Baldwin, by the way, was a good friend of William James. And William James, of course, is considered America's greatest psychologist. And if he was, James Mark Baldwin was his second greatest psychologist. And they were friends. And what's interesting is that while James Mark Baldwin was studying what we call the structures of consciousness that go through stages, William James was studying states of consciousness. And the state of consciousness is a directly, immediately aware first person experience. You're in a waking state, a dreaming state, a sleep state. The Vedanta adds two more states. The one's called Turiya, which is a transcendental state of recognizing your true self. And then Turiya Tita, which is recognizing your true self is one with everything that you're aware of. So they have 5 states of consciousness: waking, dreaming, deep dreamless sleep, Turiya, or the pure witness, and Turiya Tita, or pure non-dual awareness. So those were known for thousands of years, but these archaic, to magic, to mythic, to rational, to pluralistic, integral, those structures of consciousness, because you can't see them when you look within, unless you know what you're looking for. And so if you learn, let's say Gebser's archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, and integral, and its characteristics, then you can look within and find which of those you seem to resonate with the best. So you can find your stage of growing up if you study the situation and you learn what the various stages are. And again, you can use almost any model. It doesn't matter because they all generally agree on the basic stages of awareness. But those are important differences. And when I first started studying this and creating an integral model, which is an integration or synthesis of all the various paths to wholeness. And I discovered 5 main paths to wholeness. One is a waking up, where you find a wholeness with the whole universe. One is a growing up, where you can, at the integral stage of development, you are aware of all of the various stages that you have gone through because you study who has studied them and written about them and so on. So that's waking up, growing up, opening up, which is what goes through these stages. Well, we have not just one intelligence called cognitive intelligence, which most people are aware of. It's what you're thinking right now. That's your cognitive intelligence. but we also have an emotional intelligence, an aesthetic intelligence or perception of beauty, a spiritual intelligence, um, a spatial intelligence, a verbal intelligence, a mathematical intelligence. And all of those are they're called lines of development, but all those lines of development go through the same basic levels of development. So you can pick any, and all the various psychological developmental models generally focus on a particular line of development. So Piaget studied cognitive development, Kohlberg studied moral development, Loevinger studied self-development, Maslow studied motivational development, but they all came up with very similar stages of development. So that was a big study. That was a big realization for me. And also another realization connected with that understanding was I had myself a sort of spontaneous awakening experience when I was around 13 or 14. And because of that, I started studying the world's religions. And I, in particular, for some reason, began with Zen Buddhism. And the author who wrote extensively about Zen Buddhism was called D.E. Suzuki. And he was just a brilliant writer. And I learned all sorts of words that I had no idea what they meant. So Satori and moksha and koans and all of these were names referring to this waking up experience, which is called a Satori or a Kensho, and the stages that they go through. And I was really struck by the fact that they had 10 major stages of developing towards this full enlightenment or full awakening. And it was fascinating to me because by this time I had sort of completed my first round exploration of developmental psychological models. And all Western developmental psychologists, for some reason, ignored waking up and they just focused on growing up. So they focused on the archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, integral stages of structures of consciousness, and they ignored the states of consciousness: waking, dreaming, deep sleep, turiya, and turiyatita. And so when I started studying Zen, and as soon as I read my first book on Zen called Essays in Zen Buddhism, I was bound and determined to find a Zen master because I really wanted to study this stuff. And this was in the 60s, so I am a boomer. But the 60s was also sort of the psychedelic decade. And because of psychedelics, people were having an enormous number of altered states of consciousness. And so the psychedelic generation also introduced these states of unity consciousness. And you could take LSD, and it was very common if you took LSD to have an experience of oneness with everything. And so we of course started learning about this oneness state, and we soon found out about Zen Buddhism. And because of that, in the 60s, there was an influx of real Japanese Zen masters to America. And so I started just writing all of them that I could find their names. There were probably 24 in America at the time I began looking for them. But I finally found one, and he was a highly respected Zen master, and I started studying with him. And I was fascinated to find that Zen had these 10 stages of development towards enlightenment, because I had worked out these 8 to 9 to 10 stages of growing up by studying 100 different models of it and seeing all, and the models themselves varied from like 5 stages to 12 stages. And I sort of deduced that there were roughly 8 or 9, maybe 10 stages of growing up development. And then I saw Zen had these 10 stages towards enlightenment, and I immediately thought they were referring to the same thing. And I thought, wow, these guys have the same stages that I discovered. I'm going to go down in history. I'm brilliant. Oh, this is wild. And so I started studying all the mystical traditions. And it turns out that all the mystical traditions, although they were very different from their core religion, like a Christian mystic doesn't believe very much of the Christian fundamentalist message, but they all believe that, well, as St. Paul put it, let this consciousness be in you, which was in Christ Jesus, that we all may be one. And that was a fairly good explanation of oneness, unity consciousness. And I found that all the mystics worldwide agreed that the whole goal of life is to have this awakening experience, is to have this satori, this kensho. And so I was amazed to discover that. And I discovered that all of the world's mystic traditions tended to agree with those same basic stages of enlightenment. And those were stages that really were going through the basic states of consciousness. Because when you sit and meditate and have a immediate experience, you know it. It's a direct first person experience. And so you're tracking that. And so you're studying your state of consciousness. And that's why they came up with about 10 stages to enlightenment. And I was thrilled with that because it seemed to match my 9 or 10 stages of growing up. So I figured out I'd found this universal stage sequence. But the more I studied it, the more I realized they really were quite different. I mean, even if you just look at the names of them, waking up, or waking, dreaming, deep sleep, Turiya and Turiyatita don't even sound like archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, and integral. They don't even sound like they're dealing with the same thing, and they're not. The states are dealing with these first-person immediate experiential realities that we have, which include an experience of enlightenment or awakening or opening up. But the growing up stages just take you through a series of different worldviews or different ways you're going to interpret your experience. So at an archaic stage, you interpret the world in sort of ape-like animalistic terms. It's a very crude beginner's structure of awareness. And then the next is magic stage. And it's called magic because your mind starts out one with the things that it represents. So the mind can't yet distinguish subject from object. And so it thinks that if it changes the subjective representation of an object, like the word of an object, like the word tree, Tree, stands for the real tree. But magic hasn't yet made that differentiation. So they think if you change the symbol of the thing, you're changing the real thing. And of course, you're not at all, but that's what a person at the magic stage thinks. And all children aged 2 to 4 think magically. So they also think that if they hide under a pillow and they can't see you, you can't see them. They've magically disappeared. So that's what magic is like. And then mythic is you can no longer perform magic, but these supernatural beings can. So gods, goddesses, nature spirits, all live on Mount Olympus. So Zeus, Apollo, Aphrodite, and so on are all these gods and goddesses that populate the world, and all of them can perform magic. So you want to get on the good side of whatever God you believe in, because if you pray to them with enough sincerity and authenticity and ask a favor, they'll magically make it happen. So early in the magic period, it's very common, for example, for civilizations to pray to God to make the crops grow. And if they all prayed and did it correctly, then their crops would grow. That was the magic of the god making the crops grow. So that was the magic stage. Then at the rational stage, we no longer believe in magic of any sort. We feel we have to, if we want something done, we're going to have to do it ourselves. So this is the period that science arises, and we create universal systems of science. And they're no longer separated into different myths or different tribal realities. There's no longer Protestant chemistry and Hindu chemistry. There's just chemistry. It's the same for everybody. It's a universal system. And that gave us rationality. And that started to appear in the 1500s and 1600s in Europe, is generally referred to as the Renaissance and the Western Enlightenment. But this was the emergence of the scientific method and all the modern sciences, modern chemistry, modern biology, modern physics, modern mathematics. They all arose in about a 100 to 200 year period, starting around 1600. And so that gave us the rational stage. And then during the 1960s, a new stage started to emerge, which called itself postmodern. And the reason it called itself modern is the rational stage called itself modern because it was emerging from a traditional mythic stage. And the mythic stage is where all the world's great mythological religions were first invented and introduced. So Christian fundamentalism came to existence around 4000 BCE, and Hinduism came into existence around 10,000 BCE, and so on. They all came into existence during this vast mythic period of development. And then science emerged in the modern era, we call it. And that wasn't that long ago. That was just really 300, 400 years ago at most. And you might notice that the length of ages that these stages last becomes shorter and shorter. So when the archaic stage emerged around 400,000 BCE, it lasted until the magic stage emerged, which is around 50,000 BCE. So that was it took it about 350 years to get through that stage. And then the magic stage emerged around 50,000 BCE and lasted until around 10,000 BCE when the first great mythic stages started to emerge. And so that is around 40,000 years. So from 350,000 to 40,000 is quite a bit shorter. And then the mythic stage lasted from around 10,000 BCE till around 1600 CE, or AD as they used to call it. And so that's around 1100 years or so. So that's getting even shorter. And then from 1800s till 1960 is only around 300 or 400 years. So you can see they're getting shorter. And we expect that to continue. So evolution is really very much like a spiral that gets faster and faster and faster as you get closer to the center. And what is the center? Well, the center might be a point where everybody has a self-realization, or at least the whole culture is aware of self-realization and teaches it in its educational system and so on. But we'll find out whatever it is. That's the history of growing up. And it's very different from waking up, which had been around at least since the beginning of the magic era. So at least 50,000 years ago. And it probably had precursors going back several 100,000 years. But they are not the same at all. And the reason is that stages of growing up are, as I said, structures, and stages of waking up are states. So states of consciousness and structures of consciousness. A state of consciousness is a first-person direct immediate experience, and a structure of consciousness is something like, let's say, grammar. grammar has a set of rules that we follow, and it's very structured. It has very given patterns, and they don't change very much. They're very structured. And these structures are all third person, so they're not something we can't introspect and see these third person realities not very well. As I say, we can study them and then figure out what stage we're at and so on. But they really are quite different in terms of our capacity to be aware of them. And that's why we discovered waking up at least 100,000 years ago, and we didn't discover growing up until 100 years ago. And that was a big deal. And so for me to understand the difference between those two was a very important part of my own growth and creation of an integral framework.
Among all the stages that you discussed, some of the four stages I couldn't find a lot of information, and I couldn't find the difference nuances of each of those stages. For example, indigo, violet, ultraviolet, and clear light, these four stages. There's not much information about them. Can you share nuances of each of those stages?
Yeah, we're not very close to those stages. And so I'm sort of hypothesizing what they'll look like based on what all the previous stages have in common. So we find that each stage transcends the previous stage. In other words, it goes beyond it. So mythic went beyond magic, magic went beyond archaic, but they include it. They actually embrace it. And that transcend and include is a rule of evolution wherever we find it. So just in the natural world, atoms are transcended by molecules because molecules do more than atoms. They have more capacities and they're larger and so on, but they include atoms. So molecules transcend and include atoms, and then molecules are transcended and included in living cells. So every living cell includes molecules, but also transcends them. They can reproduce, for example, and they're living and so on. And multicellular animals transcend but include single cells, obviously. We have that relationship. And what I've done is try to see what would happen if we just sort of theoretically include these higher states. And the reason we need to include them is virtually no developmental model anywhere in the world includes any of those stages. The 100 models that I studied only include up to what I call the turquoise or the fully integral stage. But the percent of the population that reaches that stage is 0.5%. That's 1 person out of 200. It's not exactly overflowing. So the next stages, of which a very minuscule number of people are at the stage right beyond the integral stage, and you listed the four as I've sort of described them. And the first stage, I've hypothesized that one of the things that happens as we continue to grow to these higher stages is that we become aware of states of consciousness. And so we tend to include those states. And so we include the gross or physical waking state at the first stage beyond turquoise. And I call that the paramind, or and it's para because para means beside, and the paramind is beside the rational mind, and so it's a more inclusive identity, and it tends to be identified with all of Gaia, for example, or the whole Earth. So that's a form, a beginning form of cosmic consciousness, but I believe it starts at this beginning third tier. And then the next stage includes the dream state, which is also called the subtle state. And the subtle state is the home of subtle energies like Kundalini. A lot of people have heard of Kundalini energy. This is energy that goes up the spine, out through the crown of the head, and becomes one with the entire universe. Well, that can occur at the second stage beyond the turquoise. Of the 4 stages you mentioned, I call all of those third tier. And the integral stages are second tier, and the first 8 or so stages leading up to second tier are all called first tier. So first tier is archaic, magic, mythic, rational, and pluralistic. And they all have one thing in common, which is they think that their truth is the only truth in existence. So pluralism thinks it's got it right, and rationality thinks it's got it right, and mythics thinks it's got it right, magic thinks it's got it right, and so on. But what integral stages do, they're called paradigmatic and cross-paradigmatic stages. And the first stage we refer to as teal, and it is, it looks at all of the systematic, fragmented pieces that the earlier stages have created, and it finds ways to tie them all together into unified wholes, which is why it's called a paradigmatic stage, because a paradigm is a unified whole theory that takes care of an entire range of subjects, and so it's called a paradigm. And science, according to Thomas Kuhn, proceeds by major discoveries of new paradigms. So as science busts into teal, it starts creating paradigms. And paradigms are broad, unified structures of consciousness that unify many separate fragments into a unified whole. And the percent of the population at teal, or that first paradigmatic stage, is about 7 to 9% of the population is at teal. And that's very important. And then turquoise, of which there's only 0.5%, is called cross-paradigmatic, because what turquoise does is even more integrative than teal. It takes all of the paradigms that teal has discovered and brings them together into unified wholes. So integral theory is an example of a cross-paradigmatic turquoise theory. That is, well, the third of the 4 third tier stages is where the causal or deep dreamless state tends to enter. And that's just the pure witness, pure awareness, and without any qualifications or any abstract descriptions applying to it. So it's a pure emptiness type of awareness. And that tends to unite with that third state or stage structure of awareness in the third tier. And then the fourth, the clear light, is Turyatita, which is just the pure non-dual unity of the witness with everything that's witnessed. The reason that no other developmental model in the world includes any of those stages, the highest any of them go to is the turquoise stage. The reason none of them go any higher is there's only 0.5% of the population at turquoise. There's just not a lot of trans turquoise running around out there. And so when developmentalists go out and they'll take maybe 1,000 students and give them tests to see what stage they're at, they don't find anybody that's higher than turquoise. There might be one at most in the whole audience, but they're just not spotting it because they don't know what it looks like. So all the models, all 100 models that I looked at, go all the way up to turquoise, and there they stop. So, and that's called cross-paradigmatic. And that's a fairly sophisticated structure of consciousness. So you can think of integral theory. It covers a lot of areas. It claims to cover major disciplines from physics to chemistry to philosophy to religion and so on. And that's a cross-paradigmatic attempt to show how all of those disciplines fit together. And we do that using what's called quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types. And we've talked about levels, lines, and states. And we've also talked about quadrants, although I didn't label them. Quadrants are first, second, third, and fourth person perspectives. And they're when I first drew the quadrants, I simply drew a cross like that and then listed first, second, third, and fourth person. And that turns out to be the inside and the outside of the individual and the collective, or the individual and the group. So anyway, that's a sort of a brief discussion about what the third tier is like. And the reason you can't find anything on it is there is nothing written on it except what I've written.
Thank you for sharing that. Another interesting study or information I would love to get your thoughts on. Is there any information available on how these different stages interact with each other? For example, how blue interacts with turquoise, or how turquoise interacts with orange, or do they tend to kind of like be in among their own circle of? Is there a tendency to hang out with your own stage?
Right. Well, the higher you go, remember, each stage transcends but includes its predecessor. And as we become self-conscious or able to reflect on our separate selves, which happens at rationality, then we start to sort of self-consciously include our including act. We tend to become aware of it. So rationality, for example, comes up with things like philosophy and modern sciences and so on. But certain types of philosophy attempt to integrate all schools of philosophy because they can do that. And even more so pluralistic and especially integral stages. So integral is teal and turquoise, and they will reach down and embrace pluralism and rationality and mythic to some extent, and magic to a little bit. So that's what we see as we get higher and higher stages, is that embracing tendency. And so whenever I first hit the integral stages of development, I started pulling together all the various schools of philosophy and psychology and sociology and religion. And that was what I was I was explicitly trying to tie them all together. That's what I wanted to do. And so that was a conscious aim of mine. And looking back on it, if I really was pushing in the integral stages, that's exactly what you would expect somebody at an integral stage would start doing, is trying to integrate everything. And that's certainly what I was trying to do. So,
and if we have to apply this model to the current times, like for example, the recent election results, how the reaction has been polarizing. There has been like striking divide between left and right. If we have to look at try to interpret this from this different levels, tiers of thinking, first level, second level, and third level of tier of thinking, how would each tier look at what happened with the election results and potentially the divide, a societal divide that's how that could happen?
Right. Well, I should say that when developmentalists attempt to deduce what stage a person is at, they usually give it in percentages. So, like when I first reached integral stage, probably a developmentalist would say, well, about 20% of you was integral, and the rest hadn't reached integral yet. So you still had a fair amount of pluralistic and a lot of rationality and maybe some mythic. And they give each of those stages a percentage. So maybe I was 10% mythic and 15% or 20% rational and 30% green or postmodern. And so Kamala Harris was what we call fractured green. She was generally at the green stage, which meant 30 or 40% of her was green. But she fell trap to a lot of the problems with green. And one of the main problems with green is it looks at all of the universal rational systems that orange rationality created. Remember, we said there's the rationality, there's not a Protestant chemistry and a Hindu chemistry. There's just chemistry, and it's universally the same system. It's true for everybody. Well, the stage beyond that looks at all those universal systems and says, wait a minute, you've only got one system covering everything, but we've got hundreds of different countries, and each of them have their own multicultural truths. So we have to include those multicultural truths if we're going to ever reach a fully integrated or fully balanced system. But the problem is, green itself cannot discover those unified paradigms that pull all these fragments together. So they just become very fragmented in their thinking. And they can see all the different multicultural systems, but they don't have an idea about how to bring them together or see their unities. And that tended to be Kamala Harris's problem. She had a great deal of difficulty giving unified answers to her questions. And a lot of people just interpreted that as she can't answer questions at all. But what she couldn't do is she couldn't pull together all of the differentiations that she saw in her mind's eye. And that meant that she would just sort of stumble or bumble or say sort of word, they called it word salad a lot. And that's what she did. Now, Trump was very orange, a very orange, rational guy. But he still had a lot of mythic and even magic in him. And particular magic and mythic are marked by stages that are also called narcissistic. And that's the person gives a very high self-esteem, and they have a great wonder at being themselves. They're amazing. And Trump just, I mean, I once sat down and tried to write down how many narcissistic statements he said in a typical 20-minute speech. And I got to 30 of them, and he wasn't even halfway through his speech. Every other sentence was, well, I'm associated with this guy, and this guy is the greatest in the world. And I'm pretty great to recognize this guy, of course. And he just, it was one narcissistic statement after another after another. I was really kind of shocked at how many of his statements were narcissistic. But he had a very clear, rational aim and goal. And so he was very businesslike, and that's what Trump is. And somebody like Trump has no trouble sort of in the debate trouncing somebody like Kamala, because Kamala's having a hard time pulling her own ideas together. And so when she's attacked from the outside, she really doesn't respond very well. She'll say, "Oh, I love you," or something like that, but that doesn't count when you're having an actual rational argument. So that's the basic battle that we had, was orange versus green, rational versus pluralistic postmodern. And Trump is not only not postmodern, he attacks postmodernism, because postmodernism also goes under the name wokeism. So we have all this woke philosophy, and it's pure pluralistic nonsense, most of it. So it's always contradicting itself. It'll say there is no such thing as objective truth. And what they really mean is it's objectively true that there is no objective truth. And they just contradict themselves like that all the time. And that's a real problem. And that's why postmodernism as a philosophy has sort of fallen apart. It made some important introductions about there are multiple interpretations of the world and so on, but it couldn't tie them together. It couldn't explain how they're unified so that they can be part of a single collective thought. And so they just appeared confused and bumfuzzled and all of that. But that's the essential difference between Trump and Harris.
So it seems like maybe to make valuable use of some of those ideas in green, one may have to get into yellow to be able to actually apply them in a more practical manner.
Who can apply them?
Oh, I meant yellow, or in your model, it would be teal.
Teal? The teal stage is what spiral
Stage.
dynamics call yellow.
Yeah, like for example, in the green stage, there's a lot of confusion about how to integrate these ideas. There are like, theoretically, it sounds good, but there's no practical application. Whereas maybe advancing into teal stage, moving up to teal stage, you may see leaders at that stage to be able to then be able to apply some of these ideas in a practical way.
Right, and that's green moving to where?
Teal.
Teal, yes, that's exactly right. And that's what teal is designed to do, is it looks at all of the multiple universe, multicultural ideas that green has come up with, and it comes up with an enormous number of them, but can't pull them together. And it sees ways to pull them together into unified paradigms, and it proceeds to do that. So teal might come up with biology and chemistry. I mean, green would come up with biology and chemistry, and teal would come up with biochemistry and show how they actually fit together. So yeah, as green moves into teal, that's what it does. It starts bringing together all of these green fragments into paradigms. And then what turquoise does, the reason turquoise is called cross-paradigmatic, is it takes all of the paradigms that teal has come up with and includes those into super paradigms or cross paradigms like integral theory. And so we again see this increasing wholeness as we go up, because each stage transcends or goes beyond, but includes or enwraps the previous. And so naturally, evolution goes like that and just gets bigger and bigger.
And another thing that came up during this recent event was the nature of like mainstream media as source of truth. Like some see mainstream media as source of truth, whereas there are some who see it as manipulative or deeply biased. I would love to understand with each tier, how does the role of mainstream media as well as the nature of truth changes in each of these tiers?
Right. Well, basically, the truth becomes more encompassing and it includes more and more. So when you go from magic to mythic, what you're doing at magic is you're just looking at all of reality and seeing it as separate, broken up parts because you haven't figured out ways to integrate them or pull them together. And so, and you think that you can control each part by just changing the representation of the part magically. That's what magic is, remember. And when you move to mythic, you're drawing a lot of these magic pieces together into broad myths. So you create myths of the Bible, which has a unifying God pulling everything together. And you have one chosen tribe, the tribe of Israel, and it's going to create a promised land, one country where all 12 tribes can come together and be one. But myths differ from each other and they differ around the world. All the fundamental myths are different. So you have different gods and goddesses with myths, and they each can do different things. And so when you get to rationality, rationality looks at all of the mythic realities and figures out ways to test them and see which ones are true and which ones are not true. And it includes all the true ones and calls those something like philosophy or truth or mathematics or so on. And so that's a more inclusive truth. And then when you get to pluralism, you have all of these separate truths being split apart, but they each contain parts of the previous one, but not completely. And that's what happens when you get from pluralistic to teal. Teal takes all of the separate fragments and pulls them together into unified paradigms or unified wholes. And a paradigm includes an enormous number of the previously fragmented truths. And then turquoise, which is cross-paradigmatic, takes all of the previous paradigms and ties all of them together into a very encompassing truth. So you can see how truth sort of gets more and more encompassing, more inclusive, the higher the stage you go.
Thank you for sharing that. Another aspect I wanted to add to understanding what's going on currently in our society is how does AI factor into some of these models of thinking? Would it accelerate our growth even more? Do you see that happening because of AI?
Yes. I'm, by the way, four of the largest AI, three or four of the largest AI companies in America have contacted me to include an integral approach to what they're doing. So I'm working with several AI companies in order to bring an integral viewpoint to bear on AI. And AI is also pursuing a sort of its own type of integral approach in that each algorithm in an AI system includes other algorithms. And so they're transcending and including as they go along. And that's what the really great AI programmers do is they take an algorithm and they include in that algorithm yet other algorithms. So they're transcending and including as well. And I'm particularly impressed by one of the companies I'm working with, because what they want to do is have each stage of development that's built by their AI system, they want to have it transcend and include its predecessor, so that each stage can define what its successor will look like, because they'll know that its successor is going to transcend and include it. And so when they finish, if they do it right, and they put in, if they put in those features into an AI system and start with even some of the lowest stages, those stages should, their algorithm should predict what the higher stages will look like. And we're going to see how accurate that turns out to be. We'll find out how accurate the rules were they put in the lower stages. But they do know what the higher stages look like, so they know what to tell the algorithm to look for. It's going to look for something that transcends and includes your own beliefs, your own statements, your own algorithms. And they seem to be doing a pretty good job with it. So I'm excited. If we ever got an AI system that actually used the integral approach, it would, of course, be an enormous boon for the integral theory. Right now, we have sort of every major university in the country has one or two professors that know about integral, and usually one of them will actually teach a class on integral. But it's not an everyday understanding. It would become an everyday understanding if AI included it. And every time you bought a program that had an AI chat room or an AI whatever, you'd be learning an integral approach. So that would be very cool.
And AI in itself could have its own stages of development.
AI could have its own stages of development, but they would stay within the guidelines that were put in their algorithm. So they could create, I mean, supposedly the same algorithm that told it to transcend and include could include several different ways to transcend and include. And they wouldn't know which one to choose. So you could get the same stages occurring up to a point, and then its algorithm finds it has 4 different directions it could go, and it would just randomly choose one, and another algorithm would choose another one. And so they would split up and go in different directions, and we don't want that. So we'll see how tightly they can program these to reproduce the same stages that do transcend, but also include.
I'm not sure if you're busy, Ken. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I had 2 more questions, but I don't know if you're if you have to be somewhere.
No, I'm fine.
So the 2 questions I had was, like, one of them is, in our own like human evolution, do you see us, like, what are it seems like there could be different paths of evolution, and one of them could be maybe we could be merging with AI. Do you see that as one path of evolution versus being able to evolve organically through these different stages of spiral dynamics? What are your thoughts on that? Could there be multiple ways could there be multiple ways to evolve, and is merging with AI one way of evolving?
Okay, so part of the question is, are there multiple ways we could evolve as human beings? And is one of those paths merging with AI versus simply continuing to move up through the spiral, not merging with AI?
Right. Yeah. And by the way, Colin's helping me because we're having a little bit of trouble with the volume, but don't worry, we're doing fine.
Thank you, Colin.
Yeah.
Yes, we could. I mean, conceivably, that's theoretically possible, because there would be 2 different lines of evolution. One would be just humans as they continue, and one would be humans plus AI as they mutually reinforce each other. But keep in mind that we know a fair bit about the general outlines of future evolution. And we know that because we have higher stages today in a few individuals that are already growing into those higher future stages. So when the world was at mythic, there was a small percentage that had already evolved to rational and a very small percentage that had already evolved to postmodern. And so if you were taking notes at the mythic stage, you would notice at least we have two future stages that we have to go through on the whole, because that's the direction that our human evolution is growing. So I'm always curious that the people, the futurists that write about the future, almost none of them use developmental studies, because what they have is a whole map of at least the next 2, 3, or 4 stages that humanity is going to go through. I mean, at its best right now in the United States, a fair number of people are at a rational stage of development. But around the world, there are people at mythic, and in tribal societies, there are people at magic. And so somebody that's at a magic tribal stage, if they continue growing, they're going to go through a mythic stage. And if they continue growing, they're going to go through a rational stage. And if the rational keeps going, it's going to go through a pluralistic stage, because these are already the archetypes that are created and laid down in our brains, in our minds, in our culture. And they're going to unfold just as surely as when a first-year-old infant is born, they're going to go from archaic stage to a magic stage to at least a mythic stage. And those are just given. They're what the child has to grow and evolve into. And so I'm always curious. Well, developmental psychology isn't well known. I mean, when I first started studying, I had no idea that it was there. And I had certainly no idea that everybody goes through these 8 to 9 to 10 major stages of growing up. As I said, that just floored me when I found that out. But very few futurists or people trying to determine what our future is going to be like. I've never seen one of them include a developmental perspective, which is weird.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's what I see in the tech world, where it's all about AI and technical evolution.
Yeah. So
That's what she sees in the tech world. It's all about AI. I mean, you said something like that's what you see in the tech world.
Yeah, correct. That you communicated correctly.
So what you see in the tech world is this curiosity about evolution and future.
It's based on AI. There's not much interest in some of these ideas that we discussed using spiral dynamics.
Okay, so yes, they're just interested in AI. They don't care about development or
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, that's just stupid. I mean, we have these stages and they're given. They're what we are. It's like studying an embryo and not realizing that it's going to have 208 bones. It is. Well, some people say men have 208 bones and women have 207 bones. And Christians say that's right, because Eve was created with a rib of Adam. So Adam has to have one less bone. I doubt that's the explanation, but you get the point. It would be like somebody ignoring the fact that we're going to have 207 or 208 bones, and we're going to have one heart and one 2 kidneys and 1 stomach and so on. I mean, these are given structures of a human being. and they're there and we can't avoid them. And the same is true of the stages of development, at least as they've extended beyond where the average person is now. And that includes at least the pluralistic stage, the teal stage, and the turquoise stage. Those are real structures. They exist in the blueprints of being a human being. And so if you build a human being, you're building these future stages into them, just as they're going to be born at an archaic stage. And all of them are going to evolve into a magic stage. And all of those are going to evolve into a mythic stage. And there's just no exceptions that we're aware of to any of those types of structures.
Thank you so much for sharing all this insights. I greatly appreciate your work, Ken. You have no idea how much it has influenced me, and I know so many other people who have been influenced by you very deeply.
Oh, that's
So,
great. Thank you.
Is there anything else you would like to share with the audience today?
Well, what was your second question?
Are you sure you have time for it? Because
Sure.
I just want to be, I want to make sure I'm mindful and respectful about your time.
That's okay.
The other question I had was, it's a little bit different from everything we discussed so far. I was really curious about your thoughts on, so some people call it energy medicine devices, electromagnetic stimulation devices that can be used for waking up. And the reason I wanted to ask you, because you seem to be one of the very few who support the idea of using an aid to waking up, because most of the people, especially in Advaita world, they are very, they don't like the idea of meditation or using these devices or things like LSD as your like a pathway to waking up. So I'm curious about, what do you think about these devices, and do you see these devices in future like having more, like a bigger role in healing and medicine?
Yeah. Well, first of all, notice that we have as a background context what's called the most difficult problem in Western philosophy, and it's known as the mind-body problem. And the problem is our mind seems to be very ghost-like. And I mean, thoughts come and go, and they don't have body, and they're just sort of ghosts. But everybody knows that ghosts can walk through walls. So how does a ghost move our arms? And how does a ghost inhabit our body? Because if it's a real ghost, it couldn't do anything. So the point is, how does a mind interact with a body, or specifically a brain? And integral theory handles that in a very simplified fashion, following a lot of the so-called panpsychists. And I don't like that term, but a panpsychist represents about half of modern Western philosophers, like Alfred North Whitehead. And what a panpsychist believes is pan means everywhere and psyche means mind. And so they think that mind is everywhere in the universe. Some sort of consciousness or awareness is all present. I don't like the term because psyche seems to be a bit too complex an idea for an atom to have a psyche. An atom can have sort of what Whitehead called prehension, which is the very rudimentary sense of touching and awareness, and I agree with that. So I maintain that even an atom, as Whitehead maintained, has a bit of prehension, and then it has an exterior, and that's its interior, and its exterior is some form of mass and energy. And they, both the interior and the exterior, evolve. So as interior prehension becomes more evolved, and to evolve, remember, is to transcend and include. So it's becoming larger, more inclusive, more embracing. And so our awareness goes from just very simplistic sensations and rudimentary awarenesses and feelings to very specific sense organs. You can see, smell, hear, touch, taste. And then it evolves into thoughts, and we can have simple symbols and images, and then symbols, and then concepts, and then rules, and then meta rules. And that's the mind growing. And the brain body growing goes from simple sensory mechanisms on lower animals to more complex senses and neurons, and we get a whole nervous system, and we get a brain, and the brain has a reptilian brain stem and a mammalian limbic system, and then primate cortex and a neocortex. And those grow together. And from the simplest sensory feeling in an atom to more complex one in a molecule, even more complex in a cell, and even more complex in a multicellular organism. But the inside and the outside evolve simultaneously. They influence each other and they grow and develop together. And the more complex one is, the more complex the other can be. So that's, in a sense, how we fit mind into a brain and how we see them interacting with each other. And that means that our mind-body problem is not really that much of a problem. It's an inherent result of the simultaneous evolution of interiors and exteriors. And you can't have an inside without an outside. You can't have an outside without an inside. Just like all opposites are mutually dependent, you can't have up without down or left without right, and so on. So the Hindu Indians understood that because Maya is created through the play of what they call opposites or duality. And all of the universe is made of different opposites, but all opposites are non-dual. They actually go together. So that's how we handle that particular problem. And I think it makes a lot of sense.
So there is no separation between yeah, this is a bit hard to explain because usually the reason I'm asking this is it's usually in the Advaita world. When you ask them if there is a way to get to waking up, they always there's a lot of resistance towards that. They say, no, you can't, it just happens. You can't do something about it to try to get there. So that's where my question came from.
Yeah.
And so what's the actual question? So, all right, so she's saying in Advaita, they're saying there's no path to waking up. It just happens.
Yeah.
So what's your actual question?
So from what I was commenting on what he said, that
yeah,
it sounded like the interaction between inner and outer, it's
yes.
It's not like some separate thing going on, as in the Advaita world they try to communicate. I was confirming I was commenting on his point. I was not asking the question.
Okay.
The idea of there being a path to awakening, they're right. There is no path. But again, we can think about our headless condition. There's no path to get to that headless condition. We're always already headless. We always already have this unity awareness. And we can't achieve that. We already have it. We can't acquire our feet. We already have them. We can't achieve our lungs. We already have them. And we can't achieve an enlightened awareness because it's already ever present. And so that's why mystics say it exists in a timeless now, and a timeless now lives without a past or future. They're both contained in the now, And you can see how there's only a timeless now by just thinking of anything from your past that you want to and get a really good, clear image of it. Notice that you aren't really in your past. The image that you're aware of right now is only in the timeless now moment. When you think of the past, that's a present thought. The same is true if you think of the future. That's a present thought that you're having right now. There is no actual past or future. There's only a timeless, ever-present now. And you can't achieve that now. You're already living in the now. There's nothing you can do to avoid it. And not only there's nothing you can do to attain it, you can't avoid it either, because it is your ever-present condition.
Could I,
Yeah.
so part of what she asked about earlier was about the idea of energy medicine devices
Oh,
as
right.
tools
Right.
to help awaken. And is that something that you would include in an integral view?
Sure. Well, in terms of tools to help awakening, notice that there is at least two different meanings to awakening. One is achieving an ever-present now moment. And as we said, there's no path to that because that's already a reality. But then there is a difference between you recognizing that ever-present reality and you're not being aware of it. And so that's what we say when somebody takes up Zen and they studied for 3 years and then they had a big satori. Well, when they had that satori, they had a realization, and that realization had a beginning. It took them 3 years to get there. But what they're realizing is something that's ever present. So those are the two meanings, and they clearly differ. And there are ways, there are things you can do to help foster this realization. And what you realize when you realize it is that it's, the most common response that people have when they have a satori is, oh, how did I miss that? I've been aware of it the whole time. So they're really just discovering something that's always the case.
Right.
Can certain electronic devices set in motion certain brain waves? And since mind and brain are interwoven, interior and exterior, could altering the exterior waves affect an interior realization? And I happen to think they can. If you, for example, put a brainwave machine on somebody who's doing Zen and they're meditating and they get a big satori, it'll register in the brain. Brain waves will jiggle, they'll change when a person has a satori. So something has happened. And did what that person did the steps they take help foster that brain wave change? Well, sure. So yes, I happen to believe that some of these electronic equipment, if they're correctly created and they're created based on actual brainwave studies that real people have gone through, I think those would very definitely help people have a satori experience. And I don't see any problem with that at all. And after all, even Advaita Vedanta maintains that the ultimate reality is not two, Advaita, non-dual. And so that means if you change one, you're going to change the other. So, and are there ways to change the one? Yes.
Thank you. And sorry for the difficult question, because it's very hard to explain because it's a bit paradoxical. So,
Right.
but you described it beautifully. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Yeah, those were all my questions. And you would like to share anything?
No, I just, I like to encourage people to take up steps that can help lead them to a realization in their brain that will cause their mind to spot what they already know, which is always already the case, and that is your headless condition. You're always living in a timeless now. Because when you're one with everything, you're fulfilled. You literally are fulfilled. You're filled with the universe. And that's a good thing to be full of. So I highly recommend that people take up some form of meditative practice to begin with, Zen Buddhism or Vipassana meditation or something like that. And by the way, Christians have a very real and very profound Christian mystical path that they can take up. And it's almost always called a Neoplatonic form because they come from Plotinus, who was a student of Plato. And Plato, of course, is a classical archetypal mystic of the West. Aristotle is the classic rationalist of the West. And so they didn't agree on everything. But Aristotle was Plato's pupil, and Plato was Socrates' pupil. So we have a nice kind of lineage going there. It's a Christian mystic way. If you're a Christian, you can definitely seek to have a Christ consciousness experience, which St. Paul described as, let this consciousness be in you, which was in Christ Jesus, that we all may be one. And that's what Jesus Christ was. He was a simple human being. He wasn't the Son of God. I mean, he wasn't born of a biological virgin. Those are all mythic concepts, and they were created during the mythic period. He was an ordinary human being that had a profound awakening. What he awakened to was his real self, and his real self was one with God, by whatever name you wanted to call it. And so that's what all Christian mystics since then have been doing. They've been becoming one with Christ, which is one with God, which is one with everything. So they're having that unity experience. And again, that's a very fine experience. And I highly recommend it. You want to have that kind of experience. It'll get you through the day. So I would sort of end with that message, I guess.
Thank you so much for this beautiful message. Yeah, I completely resonate with you. I think self-realization can be a big milestone in life. Like it's a life-changing realization to have.
Well, thank you.